For sessions, I would remind speakers, please, to try and constrain yourselves to quarter of an hour. We're running slightly late. So, Théodore, over to you. If you could put that on for our online page.
Dear colleagues, first of all, I would like to warmly thank the team who organized this symposium, Claudine, Boguslav, Nigel, as well as Pieralo, and all those who have kindly welcomed us here at the University of Liège. After 60 years of existence and numerous theoretical reflections, ICOMOS continues to face new challenges today. These include the unprecedented hazards caused by climate change, which are having a profound impact on monuments and heritage sites. However, the exposure of monuments to climatic hazards is far from being a new phenomenon. It is worth recalling that in the 20th century, the very birth of ICOMOS took place in an international context where major iconic sites were simultaneously threatened by unparalleled environmental risks, notably the threat of the Nubian temples being submerged by Lake Nasser. Although these threats prompted rapid reactions from the international community, their influence on doctrinal and theoretical debates was in fact delayed and gradual. Over the following decades, risk prevention gradually became a central theme of the debates. While the scale and accelerating pace of current upheaval are unprecedented, this raises an important question. To what extent do these theoretical issues now need to be reconsidered? This presentation will try to outline an answer to this question and will be divided into three parts. First, it will begin by briefly tracing the gradual recognition of environmental risk to heritage since the founding of UNESCO. Second, I will briefly define the various phenomena of vulnerability to climate risks. Third, and finally, I will attempt to assess the theoretical implication of this theme by seeking to outline the contributions and limitations of this pair of concepts in theoretical and doctrinal terms. Well, I'll try, sorry about this, I will begin with this history, of course. The understanding of the risks to heritage has a long history, which, as we know, is inseparable from the emergence of conservation theories. While it is impossible to go back as far as the Renaissance and the modern era, it is necessary to take a brief look at the evolution of the debate on the links between heritage and risks since 1945. At the end of the Second World War, these risks were initially addressed through the issue of armed conflict within the framework of the 1954 Hague Convention. It was not until the following decade that the issue of environmental risks came to the fore, prompted by the risks faced by the temples in Nubia. These discussions benefited from the framework of ICOM, which had been founded a few years earlier, and were further stimulated by the great flood of the Arno that inundated Florence in 1966.
Ah, okay.
Let's see who's.
Is everyone muted? Okay.
It took another generation for these concerns to resurface in the 1990s, notably in the documents drawn up by the Council of Europe in 1993 followed by the Declaration of Quebec in 1996, which led to the founding of the Blue Shield, and then the International Scientific Committee on Risk Preparedness in 1997. It was mainly in the wake of the signing of the Kyoto Protocol in that same year, in a context marked by a better understanding of climate change, that specific consideration of these issues became more concrete. It was during the 29th session of the World Heritage Committee in Durban, South Africa in 2005, that the issue of climate change's impact on World Heritage was brought to UNESCO's attention. Since then, reports on these issues have been published at a rapid pace, particularly by working groups on World Heritage, leading to an initial policy document in 2007. The following year saw the inclusion of sites in danger with climate change, among the potential threats. Over the past 10 years, these threats have been recognized as having an increasing impact on heritage worldwide. Based on this observation, ICOMOS published a report in 2019 entitled The Future of Our Pasts, which sought to draw up a comprehensive list of ways in which cultural properties can contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation in line with the objective of the 2015 Paris Agreement. At the same time, UNESCO was regularly reviewing its guidance documents on this subject, which ultimately led to the adoption in 2023 of the policy document on climate action for World Heritage. When situated within the long-term evolution of conservation theory, the numerous texts published over the past 20 years on the impact of climate change on cultural heritage seem to constitute a theoretical paradigm shift, giving central importance to the concept of vulnerability to risks. How can we define these two concepts, vulnerability, risks? The wide variety of environmental risks makes it difficult to establish a single definition that is independent of their characterization in each particular situation. In the absence of relevant statistics on a global scale, some data relating to World Heritage can, for example, outline the main characteristics of the risks identified today, which manifest themselves as climate hazards of increasing scale and intensity, considerable material, political, economical, and above all, social implications affecting millions of people, particularly in Asia, complex and often unpredictable phenomena. And among these risks, those related to water are particularly important. They have been the cause of 90% of natural disaster since 1970, and today expose more than 70% of World Heritage sites. Half of these are threatened by drought and a third by flooding, representing around 400 World Heritage sites. The concept of vulnerability, whose definition itself depends on these same risks, can be the subject of a separate discussion, which remains but partly implicit and therefore requires clarification. The report published by ICOMOS in 2019 entitled The Future of Our Past defines this vulnerability as the propensity or predisposition to be adversely affected, adding that vulnerability encompasses a variety of concepts and elements, including sensitivity or susceptibility to harm and lack of capacity to cope and adapt. Thus, the term often appears to be synonymous with fragile or equated with a form of weakness, particularly in terms of the various heritage values of sites. This pejorative connotation is partly culturally embedded in a cultural heritage that in the West has elevated Vitruvian's firmitas to an architectural value for millennia. More specifically, this definition presents it as a combination of possible impacts of climate change and established heritage significance. This vulnerability can now be assessed by indices established using shared methodologies, currently being refined, taking into account various aspects such as the resilience of sites. In these texts, the term is also used to refer to population communities themselves, particularly in UNESCO reports, which focus on development and poverty reduction issues. Despite appearing univocal, the concept in fact carries a certain ambivalence insofar as cultural property and people are not equally exposed to climate risks. This creates tensions with the multiple development objectives promoted by UNESCO, while in the 2023 document rightly highlights the partial convergence between environmental risks and community cohesion, risk management and conservation cannot be equated, as they are often divergent, even competing options. This ambivalence ultimately lies in the fact that vulnerability can sometimes have certain positive effects. Would it therefore be justified to consider it as a heritage value? Recognized as a criterion that promotes heritage processes, it can indeed be a lever for attractiveness, particularly for attracting financial aid and becoming a factor in community engagement. However, it seems that we can also recognize its status as a value because of symbolic and critical function of alterations, this time from the perspective of an ethic consisting of consent to vulnerability. At the dawn of a century that is set to see extensive damage to a large number of monuments, we can finally formulate some avenues for reflection in order to move beyond the actual guidelines. Recognizing that it seems difficult to hope to fully safeguard cultural heritage from the effects of climate change, we may question the scope and historical significance of their alteration. Their vulnerability will undoubtedly offer the 21st century a kind of mirror in which to contemplate the uncertainty of human affairs in question the future, but also awaken sensitivity to loss and sharpen historical consciousness. Walter Benjamin wrote in this vein that ruins are the visibility of societies in times of distress. As suggested by several philosophers and anthropologists today, the scale of these changes is such that they are likely to alter the very meaning of our collective conception of history, which in this respect should lead us in the coming years to reconsider the body of theoretical and doctrinal thinking on the conservation of monuments. In light of such hypotheses, it is already clear that damage is likely to affect cultural property in very diverse and unevenly timely ways, sometimes paving the way for the picturesque effects of ruins so highly praised by John Ruskin, and before him Denis Diderot, who believed that a monument must be ruined in order to become interesting. However, Such acceptance of vulnerability would not be limited to simple abandonment, but could find points of convergence with preventive approaches, such as, for example, the redevelopment of public spaces around monuments with a view to managing flood risks. These multiple forms of vulnerability are, in fact, interdependent, thus forming a complex phenomenon. This phenomenon also relates to the field of environmental risks, which itself draws on contribution from many disciplines: climate sciences, risk geography, foresight, hydrology, geology, civil security, etc. For these reasons, the issue of vulnerability to climate risks opens up the conservation theories to a broader horizon of insights, which, like the environmental humanities themselves, form a meta-discipline. While vulnerability may at first glance appear to be a simple attribute affecting traditional heritage values, it undoubtedly merits being understood as a value, or even as a meta-value, insofar as it influences the way in which other values, such as authenticity, are appreciated. In this respect, it provides a highly useful lens today, offering a filter for analysis that combines scientific insights and political issues. This perspective could ultimately lead to a complete reassessment of heritage values, placing a new price on particularly threatened assets and making our most fragile legacies into our most valuable. Thank you for your attention.
Okay, please. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kameli Zephaniia Bwambale. I am from the Association of World Heritage Ambassadors in Uganda. I can go next. Okay, thank you so much once again. Sorry for the disconnections, but just like I said, my name is Kameli Zephaniia Bwambale. I'm from Uganda, and I'm going to present about decolonizing World Heritage Stewardship, and I'm going to share the reflections from the Rwenzori Mountains National Park in Uganda. This is a World Heritage Site, and it is recognized for the breathtaking landscapes, but also the rich cultural heritage, especially associated with an ethnic group called known as the Vakonso. So this iconic environment reveals the critical insights, especially about the concept of heritage stewardship within the African context. So this presentation explores the ways in which the Rwenzori Mountains serve as sacred spaces, but also cultural identity markers, especially for these communities, emphasizing the interplay between traditional practices, spiritual beliefs, but also the environmental stewardship amidst the challenges posed by the globalization and also climate change. So you can go next.
We can see your slide, so maybe you can continue.
Okay. So these mountains, they are located in Uganda, and they are found at the DRC, that is the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Uganda. So I'm going to talk about colonial legacy, especially when it started at the Rwenzori Mountains National Park. That was around the 19th century. And of course, colonization is when the Europeans reached East Africa and Uganda. They said they had discovered the Rwenzori Mountains, but we cannot confirm that because the local people, the Bakonzo, were already settled on this mountain. So under the colonial rule, lands were demarcated, especially into land reserves, but also later national parks, often without consulting the Bakonzo, that is the indigenous people. And these sacred spaces were exploited. For example, there was a lot of mining at Kilembe. Kilembe is one of the road entries to the Rwenzori Mountains National Park. And of course, heritage was seen as something to protect from the people, but not with the people. So a lot of indigenous knowledge endured here, especially, for example, the Bakonzo called this mountain is Rwenzori, which means the rainmaker, and they believe that there is a supreme spirit that live in these glaciers. So these indigenous people have a lot of rituals and taboos, and this has shaped sustainable land use. For example, there is no one of the taboo is to cut trees at certain river streams. It prohibits washing, for example, from the sacred river streams. And there is research that has been conducted by us at Association of World Heritage Ambassadors in Uganda in collaboration with the Musingika Foundation, and has helped us to map sacred sites, but also oral traditions. And during this research reveals that there is a deep ecological wisdom that has been practiced by the indigenous people all along from the colonial time. So what are those threats that are facing the Rwenzori Mountains? First of all, this is one of the mountains that have glaciers throughout the year, that is from January to December. But what to understand is that these glaciers are vanishing. For example, the Stanley Peak, one of the peaks around the Rwenzori Mountains, has lost almost a third of its ice just in one decade. And some of the springs have dried up. We have witnessed floods and landslides, which are increasing, including the wildfire that happened in 2012. Now we can see the highlands are becoming bare. So these glaciers feed the community, especially the Rwenzori Mountain is a water catchment area. So when these glaciers disappear, it is one of the threats to life around 5 million people. So the Bakonzo indigenous people believe that the loss is also spiritual, because they think the home of their supreme god or diet is melting. So the research I talked about, especially from the Association of World Heritage Ambassadors in Uganda, united a lot of stakeholders, for example, the park rangers, the elders, the scientists, the youth, and we found that some traditional sites are missing from the park management plans. And through community dialogues, we have blended indigenous stories with scientific data. So when you talk to villagers, they describe the mountain as angry, aligning with the glacial retreat patterns. So this co-learning became the heart of the decolonization stewardship. So what are the challenges at this mountain? First of all, the communities remember forced removals and arrests for using forest resources. They also report language barrier complicated in terms like biodiversity. When we talk about biodiversity and it is not translated in our local languages. It is one of the challenges that the communities don't understand. So we also see that one of the challenges that some officials have dismissed rituals as irrelevant, but these rituals and taboos have been practiced all along since the mountain was created by God. But also we understand that one of the challenges is funding delays that is leading to slowed progress, yet trust building and action, for example, like restoring riverbanks, remain vital. So some of the lessons we have learned from this is that we need to honor multiple truths. We also need to connect science and stories because both of them matter. And indigenous knowledge is durable wisdom for climate resilience. That is some of the lessons that we have learned, especially when the indigenous Bakonzo do their rituals, because as I have highlighted, there is a lot of rituals and food and then taboos that have protected this mountain. So one other lesson is that co-management with the communities build a trust and ownership. Another lesson is that acknowledging past opens path to healing and solidarity. So as a result of this, some of the recommendations is that we need to include community voices in real decision making. Then we need to embed climate adaptation in heritage frameworks, treat sacred sites as climate sanctuaries, and also promoting mutual learning through shared training and also participation in traditional ceremonies. For instance, we have one of the indigenous Bakonzo have one of the traditional ceremonies that include the cleansing of the mountains, but also the peaks. So these are some of the rituals that has been done for a long time, and the purpose is to keep alive the traditional knowledge. We also need to broaden education, especially to include the Bakonzo stories alongside the science that has been promoted instead of the Bakonzo stories. So looking forward, decolonizing stewardship heals the relationships, especially between the people and nature. So when we see a melting glacier, it is not just the lost data, it is also identity lost. And by weaving narratives together, like children performing plays about ecological knowledge, about reforestation, we also restore dignity and hope. So to the conclusion, we must protect, for example, the Rwenzori Mountains National Park, and this should be done not only at the Rwenzori Mountains National Park, but also other World Heritage Sites in Uganda, in Africa, and the entire world. So we must connect past and present. We must connect people and the policy. We must connect the myth and the measurement, because the first guardians of heritage are the people who love it. And one of the elders during our community outreach said, if we work together, our ancestors and your sires may be the, if we work together, our ancestors and your sires, maybe the mountain will forgive us, because the indigenous Bakonzo believe that the mountain is very, very angry. That is why we are witnessing a lot of floods. We are witnessing a lot of wildfire. We are witnessing a lot of landslides. So I thank you for your attention. Thank you so much. Greetings from Uganda. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kameli. I'm sorry, as you didn't say when I had to change the slides, I did my best, but I think it was maybe not perfect.
Yeah,
but,
you can just,
thank you very much.
move. Yeah, you can just move the slides for the audience to see, because I realized it would take me time, so I had to just continue with the presentation. But you
Okay.
can,
Okay.
yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you to organizer and the committee, TheoPhilos committee, for giving us this opportunity of sharing experiences and reflections. As you can see from with the title of my presentation, I will start with Naples, a well-known city in the world for its music, food, beauty, geological sites, in short, for its richness of both tangible and intangible assets. It is the starting point for two main reasons. The first is that the city in 2025 has been the place of a significant institutional debate. The second reason is that despite some critical issues that we will see after, the city is still authentic in a way, and this characteristic makes Naples an interesting case study. The UNESCO second edition of the Naples Conference on Cultural Heritage in the 21st century established the Naples Conference as a regular platform of reflection with a view to becoming a point of reference in the debate for years to come. This second edition of the conference wanted to launch a practical toolkit for the local administrator involved with UNESCO sites and some elements for the management of the heritage. What are the interesting points? In line with the 2023 spirit of Naples call for action, the core of the conference is the spirit of Naples. But let's have a look at some descriptions, visions of the city. You can see there some observations. There are no references to material elements. There are many descriptions that draw Naples through the building, its natural beauty, and so on. But the fact that many scholars and intellectuals have spoken of it through reference to the people, the way of life, the atmosphere, make it clear that beyond appearance, the city of Naples is made up of a profound intangibility, immateriality. And this perhaps drives to specific reflections on the relationship between tangible and intangible heritage, and about authenticity too. Just some data about Naples. These images perhaps provide the dimension from which we can start to grasp Naples, a site that was born on the hill of Pizzo Falcone, the movement along the coast of the new settlements, and immediately two systems of relations. The first with the sea, the bay, and a great caldera of exchange with other civilizations. The second with the underground dimension. A settlement quite far from the two destructive natural elements, Vesuvius and Campi Flegrei, together with outstanding anthropological density. Here, they are excited for my presentation.
Excuse me, those online, could you please mute your microphones? The people who are attending online. Thank you very much.
Here, the so-called Tavola Strozzi gives us the image of a thriving city, town dominated by the Spanish Aragonese, with an important port, the restored castle, and above all, a living city with commercial activities and the population growing in numbers. And evidence of this is the dense built-up area very close to the walls. This plan of 1566 shows us how the center, after almost 2,000 years, is still the same. The layout is the same, and the buildings with vertical stratification have foundations and sometimes masonry of the Roman and the Ducal times. In a very short summary, we have a city with this kind of historical depth, from the 2015 years old part in brown to the 50 years old part in gray. A complexity of enormous proportions with the problems of a metropolis, but with a historical identity that is reflected both in some parts of the old center and in the social structure. This is the list, a list of urban plans, and the application to designate the historical center of Naples as a UNESCO site dates from 1994, while the Grand Framework Program dates from 2009. Of particular relevance is the inclusion of the arbor strip and the buffer zone. The inclusion of the strip provides the implementation of the UNESCO recommendation formulated in the historic urban landscape document. You can see the criteria. Concerning the criteria of authenticity, the town plan has a high level of authenticity and has rated considerable evidence of the Greco-Roman city and the pattern of the 16th century Spanish quarter. There is a remarkable continuity in the use of materials, technique, but we have to say that this vision, however, of authenticity referred only to techniques, materials, and spatial and volumetric characteristics does not fit in with the vision of a historical urban landscape, which is a complex dimension, especially for the high degree of complexity of the city of Naples. We have the Grand Project Historic Center of Naples Enhancement of the UNESCO site, which aims to contribute to the redevelopment of the historic core of the historic city of Naples. In 2010, we have the Parisian agreement signed between the Campania region, Municipality of Naples, and UNESCO for the drafting of the management plan. And we can notice that the preliminary study for the management plan for the UNESCO site of the Historical Center of Naples made an experimental application of the HUL concept, which was approved just in November by UNESCO. For that, the Historic Center of Naples could represent an emblematic case study of the historic urban landscape approach as a very representative example of a urban settlement understood as historical layering of cultural and natural values. Today, in line with the 2023 Spirit of Naples Call for Action, the second edition of the conference is based on an interdisciplinary and integrated approach between tangible and intangible heritage. There was large geographical representativity of experts attending the conference, and the multiculturalism and the heterogeneity of cultural expressions of Naples also make this southern city a unique ideal hub to give ample space to voices from the global south. The Spirit of Naples, it means that the objective of UNESCO World Heritage Convention and the Intangible Cultural Heritage Convention 2003 are interconnected, as tangible and intangible heritage cannot be conceived as separate. So the conference considered the intrinsic interdependence between intangible heritage and tangible cultural natural heritage, ideally to be considered as human heritage as a whole. In short, these are the key words: holistic approach, interconnection of nature and culture, the well-being and sustainable livelihoods and local communities, implement sustainable tourist policies, social and economic inclusion. This is the session. And in 2024, a technical scientific committee for the drafting of the UNESCO management plan for Naples groups and subgroups have been created. A work in progress for which there is a need to define the theoretical aspects and approach to such a complex task. Probably further work needs to be done on the tangible aspects of heritage, or better said, on the tangible and tangible relationship, and also to stress on the two categories of cultural landscape and historical urban landscape. Now, criticalities. As other many cities, we have the over-tourism, a real boom. You can see here some data. To deal with this problem, municipality has focused on widespread events, regulating tourist rentals, and promoting sustainable tourism. Nevertheless, today, maybe little in contrast to a world, the trend of globalization, the city of Naples, with tourism on the rise and the focus of film production, which maybe contributes to the diffusion of a human side of Naples. Naples still has and conserve places where people experience ways of life that express belonging to a traditional culture and identity, where people not only don't perceive values, but it still lives them, and the sort of sociality is reflected in the Naples underground, in religious cults and the geological environment. A city where tangible and tangible values meet each other, and where experience of the place and the values are interconnected. In addition, with reference to Naples, we have to say that there is also a tradition of studies that have looked at the problems of the city from a different point of view, an inclusive one, and probably closer to the topic of a cultural landscape than historic center, anticipating a greater inclination to keep the tangible and intangible aspects of heritage integrated. Here we see Baia di Napoli by Roberto Di Stefano and others, who, in highlighting some difficulties in including the historic center of Naples in the World Heritage List, asserted the opportunity to include the bay as a unitary mixed asset, cultural and natural. A visible approach is visible in the other publication, other volumes, based on the enhancement of a cultural landscape. Focus on. All that we saw brings us to the focal point of this conference, emphasizing the need to share experiences and focus on concepts related to the interpretation of cultural heritage, which are particularly challenging contemporary uses. That are the following notions and topics, in my opinion. This requires us to set up a series of conceptual steps and relate them to one another, particularly those that concern in various ways, above all, the relationship between the intangible and the material dimensions. Apart from the concept of progressive authenticity, emerged in 1977, we have the categories of a cultural landscape came out from La Petite Pierre in 1992. We are well aware of the intangible nature of the cultural landscape through the articulation of its categories. And we cannot deny that there is a deep interaction between authenticity and the notion of a cultural landscape, and the dynamic nature of both notions is intertwined with the people and its environment. The same NARA declaration accepts forms and means of tangible and intangible expressions as the core of heritage, and also considers that efforts to update authenticity assessment in light of changing values and situations are needed. This dynamic view of the concept of authenticity is confirmed by subsequent documents which reflect the progress of the interpretation of heritage, based on the strong interaction between the environment in all forms and its communities. With regard to this last aspect, this factor, entirely intangible, is common to the cultural landscape category, and we must remember the notion of landscape is mainly linked to the interpretation of communities, which is like saying constantly recreated. After the 10 years, another Japanese document has addressed the authenticity issues, the Yamato Declaration. Among the issues, we find the starting points as the interdependence between intangible and intangible, the involvement of communities, the relevance of the concept of authenticity for intangible heritage. Some outcomes of Yamato Declaration recalls intangible heritage, considers the contextualization of the authenticity. More, Yamato considers that the intangible cultural heritage is constantly recreated, and the term authenticity as applied to tangible cultural heritage is not relevant when identifying intangible cultural heritage. So in this case, Yamato Declaration does not seem to associate this constant recreation to an idea of progressive authenticity, which emerged in and established itself as a conceptual evolution since 1977. Conclusion. It has been remarked that during, as Francesco Bandarin states, during the 1990s and the 2012, several important innovations have come out, ranging from the adoption of 2 new international conventions on the intangible heritage and the diversity of cultural expression, convention, Faro Convention, and the World Heritage Convention has evolved with the inclusion of new heritage types as such as a cultural landscape. The debate on the conservation of urban heritage has led to the Vienna Memorandum on the historic urban landscape recommendation, and it is commonly recognized that an integrated approach of different heritage conventions and the synergy effects between them, it would be useful to review if the concept of authenticity would be more appropriate. Some question for us. How and to what extent does this state of facts suggest lines of work for ICOMOS in the field of theory and philosophy? What reference documents and their conceptual passages steps could be used as a starting point for reflection? What is the approach to the reflection from a theoretical and philosophical point of view for addressing the complexity of contemporary issues? What are the key issues around which to develop the reflection? I believe that the documents cited that can indicate a possible roadmap to follow in order to address the issues of heritage preservation in terms of both its its physical consistence and its dynamic meanings. However, the key concept of authenticity in its sociological, economic, anthropological, and other aspects should be, could be a filter, or should be, for glimpsing the validity of a critical rethinking of our mission. We spoke about the spirit of Naples, which is also expressed through these forms of urban creativity that materially become part of the intangible values of the city. The focus on city made up of story, peoples, always, and life lets director through this Stiller, Sting's wife, to say that the future is in Naples. Maybe, I don't know. Thank you very much.
First of all, before I start, I would like to thank the University of Liège for this hospitality and TheoPhilos for this opportunity. Secondly, I would like to confess that during the presentation or preparation, I realized that my presentation is shifting from a financial tool to financial ethics. So you may see some mismatches with the title and the abstract and the content of my presentation. Please follow the presentation titled as Financing Heritage Conservation Beyond Instruments Towards an Ethical Framework. And finally, as you see on the first slide, there will be some pictures within my presentation which are not related with the content. They represent 22 World Heritage Sites of Türkiye. It was a boring written material, so those pictures bring some
Okay. So normally it should work.
Okay. Okay, sorry. Over the last decades, conservation theory has advanced significantly, and in this body of theory, finance is primarily treated as an external technical issue rather than a fundamental factor of conservation ethics. Finance is often presented as a natural enabler of conservation rather than an area where power, distributional fairness, and commodification must be evaluated critically. And without a guiding ethical framework, finance becomes a technical fix, applies based on market logic, and therefore subjecting heritage to market forces. I would like to discuss this issue within the broader neoliberal reorganization of public sector, in which public goods are supposed to be self-financing, cultural heritage is reframed as a competing asset, and market-based financial instruments like public-private partnership contracts are promoted. I argue that the primary challenge of heritage finance is not the lack of financial instruments, there are plenty of them, but the lack of coherent theoretical and moral framework that asks which of these instruments are compatible with heritage values, under what conditions, and how should trade-offs be negotiated when financial efficiency conflicts with authenticity, social justice, or intergenerational equity. Within this framework, I attempt to answer the question, what does it mean to treat heritage finance as a subject of ethics rather than just economics and administration? And this main question brings sub-questions along. 9 of them will be answered under 4 sections in this presentation. So neoliberal governance and neoliberal economies. Neoliberal governance has profoundly reshaped the heritage finance. The rise of neoliberal economic policies since the late 20th century has undercut the post-war model of heritage as a predominantly state-funded public good. Across many countries, public spending on heritage has stagnated or decreased due to fiscal austerity, decentralization, and competing policy priorities. Neoliberalism has reframed heritage as an asset capable of generating economic returns. Despite public funding remains the normative foundation of conservation, there is a persistent and widening gap between the scale of listed heritage and the resources available to maintain them. This structural inefficiency is not simply a technical matter of budget allocation, but reflects shifting political and ideological priorities also. Under neoliberal governance, culture is often repositioned from a right to an investment that must pay for itself. Moreover, public budgeting cycles seldom align with the long-term horizons of conservation, which creates instability. And under such conditions, heritage increasingly relies on hybrid funding models that blend public, private, and third sector resources. And public-private partnership contracts, concession agreements, and value capture mechanisms are now common, which means that neoliberal financial instruments are subtly reshaping what heritage is for, who benefits from it, and how it is managed. Based mechanisms are frequently promoted as solutions to public funding shortages, and public-private partnership is one of the mechanisms gaining popularity nowadays. It can be defined as a long-term contract where private or third sector partners assume significantly responsibilities for financing, operating, and maintaining heritage assets, while the public sector retains ultimate accountability. In principle, these agreements can mobilize additional capital, diversify expertise, and share risk. However, these benefits come with significant risks. Market logics prioritize profit, efficiency, and competitive advantage. These values that often conflict with conservation principles. And this structural asymmetry creates risks when heritage values come into tension with profit maximizing logics. In practice, public-private partnership contracts may prioritize revenue-generating uses or restrict public access. And without ethical safeguards, the economic logic can gradually reshape what is considered successful. And the danger is not the market mechanisms are inherently incompatible with heritage, but that in the absence of ethical framework. And without this framework, negative impacts appear as unintended consequences rather than predictable outcomes of financial choices. And recognizing finance as a moral issue would allow experts to predict and prevent such impacts. And analyzing this finance issue in ICOMOS doctrinal texts, but I realized that we all agree ICOMOS has played a leading role in articulating global conservation principles, and doctrinal texts provides robust ethical guidance for technical and social aspects. But in these texts, finance appears rarely or in different circumstances under 4 categories. And I'm not going to go in depth to these categories, but finance as an administrative requirement, just a technical necessity. Sometimes finance as a part of sustainable development, welcoming different financial sources for the economic development. And sometimes finance as a benefit of tourism, a revenue generating tool, and rarely finance as an ethical issue. That's something that must not violate ethical boundaries. But when we examine the doctrinal texts, what is missing here is a clear actionable principles for heritage finance. We have no systematic guidance on acceptable or unacceptable financial models or criteria for evaluating financial instruments like public-private partnership contracts, or standards for transparency and accountability in financial decision-making. There is no guidance on what constitutes ethical funding sources or how profit sharing should be structured to align with heritage values. This omission leaves experts without conceptual tools to manage increasingly complex financial landscape of neoliberal economies. And then I asked why this gap exists, why this omission occurred. And I think it is because of the founding disciplines of ICOMOS. Historically, ICOMOS evolved from professionals whose expertise lay in physical conservation and cultural theory rather than in political economy. So finance was implicitly positioned as a governmental or technical matter outside the core of conservation ethics. Moreover, economic issues were long perceived as threats, pressure of development, or insufficient resources, rather than as domains where proactive ethical guidance could be articulated. And as a result, financial mechanisms have been adapted reactively with little theoretical reflection, precisely at the moment when neoliberalism makes financial agreements central to heritage feature. And this is an instrumental thinking, according to my opinion. And what are the consequences of such kind of a thinking? Of course, there are significant consequences. First of all, it facilitates the adaptation of financial instruments that prioritize short-term gain over long-term stewardship. For example, public-private partnership contracts can be structured around concession periods, revenue guarantees, and performance indicators without adequately accounting for the nature of heritage. And secondly, instrumental thinking treats gentrification, displacement, and exclusion as side effects rather than ethical issues. They are the consequences of our financial choices, actually, not just side effects. And thirdly, instrumental thinking leaves heritage vulnerable to inappropriate funding sources, such as sponsors with conflicting values, or to unsustainable financial models that collapse during crisis, economic crisis. So why we should consider finance as a moral issue? There are three specific reasons. First of all, finance is not a technical issue, but it is a value shaping activity. Financial decisions shape what gets conserved, how it is interpreted, who has access and who benefits. And they therefore carry moral significance. And from this perspective, finance is not merely a means to support conservation outcomes, but it is a value shaping practice. And recognizing finance as a value shaping activity reframes it as a part of conservation itself, not a background technicality. And this perspective requires the development of ethical principles. And the second, stewardship, often associated with responsibilities towards future generations and towards communities who identify with heritage places. It is often discussed in technical or cultural terms, not in financial terms. And financial models that prioritize short-term gains over long-term sustainability violates this principle. When we finance through the lens of stewardship, there are some questions. Is it acceptable to enter financial agreements that secure conservation for a period but risks abandonment thereafter? Should contracts include provision for long-term maintenance beyond the concession period? How should investors' right be balanced with the character of heritage as a public good and cultural right? These are not technical questions, actually, they are moral questions. And recognizing finance as a part of stewardship highlights the moral obligation to design financial models that support long-term care, not immediate extraction. And intergenerational justice that requires present generations preserve heritage in conditions that enable future generations to benefit. We generally consider this issue as the maintenance of the physical aspects, but we should consider this issue also from the financial perspective. Financial models can undermine this principle by shifting costs and risks forward in time to future generations, which is also a problematic issue. For example, structuring public-private partnership contracts that leave the public sector with major liabilities at contract end effectively externalize financial burdens to future taxpayers. And integrating intergenerational justice into financial ethics would demand clear consideration of long-term obligations, resilience under economic shocks, and safeguards against decisions that often short-term gains at the expense of future opinions. And here I would like to discuss an ethical framework as a network of relationships among actors, resources, and institutions. Within this network, finance plays the connective role. It allocates attention, enables continuity, and materializes responsibility. This framework has three pillars. The first one is the ethical integrity. It endures the enduring commitment to fairness, authenticity, and respect to cultural diversity. In practical terms, it means that funding priorities and investment decisions must be inclusive and guiding by shared criteria of cultural significance. Moreover, ethical integrity involves reflexivity, the continuous evaluation of whether financial mechanisms respect the plural values of communities. The second pillar is economic responsibility. It translates ethical commitments into sustainable resource management. It doesn't mean maximizing efficiency or profit. It means ensuring that the allocation and use of funds reflect principles of transparency, accountability, and long-term stewardship. By foregrounding economic responsibility, heritage institutions can transform finance from an instrument of scarcity management into a framework of shared accountability. And thirdly, civic participation. It anchors the previous two in democratic legitimacy. Heritage exists because communities attribute meaning and values to it. Without civic participation, ethical integrity remains abstract and economic responsibility risks technocratic isolation. And here, civic participation entails more than consultation. It involves co-decision and co-financing, actually. And going back to the first slide of this part, these three pillars are not sequential steps, but independent dimensions of a single system. Ethical integrity provides direction, economic responsibility provides structure, and civic participation provides legitimacy. When balanced, they form a feedback loop of sustainability. Moral values guide financial decisions, financial systems enable care, and public participation renews trust and meaning. Rather than treating ethics and finance as opposites, we can conceive them as mutually constitutive forces. Every financial decision is an ethical act because they express priorities, and every ethical principle must find financial embodiment to remain operative. And this system requires some moral principles, instrument-specific safeguards, and governance mechanisms. And when I ask myself what kind of practical tools we can use to secure financial ethics, there are three of them, just as a brainstorming. Ethical, okay, it is conclusion at the moment. Ethical impact assessment, finance heritage compatibility matrix, or model clauses. And finally, the lack of ethical framework must direct financial decisions is the main difficulty of heritage finance. And ICOMOS could consider integrating financial ethics into their doctrines. Political economy and financial justice must now be incorporated into conservation theory to create a second generation of conservation economics that moves from value and funding to normative financial regimes. So a shift from how to fund to how to fund responsibility is my suggestion. Thank you for your patience.
Sorry. So we we have gone over our time a little bit, but it would be good if there are any questions in the room. We've had 4 very varied contributions in this session. Are there any questions in the room for our speakers? Or any contributions that are provoked by our speakers? In which case, we will break for lunch.